In a city where millions of people pass each other every day, it is easy to assume that nothing truly disappears. Noise fills the streets, buildings are always occupied, and someone is always watching. Yet in 2002, a child vanished in Harlem without drawing attention. There were no urgent calls, no public searches, no moment when the city paused to ask where she had gone. Time moved forward as if nothing had changed. Years later, when her name finally surfaced, the most unsettling detail was not what had happened, but how quietly it happened. No one outside a small circle noticed she was gone. No official record marked the day she disappeared. What followed was not a mystery built on clues, but one shaped by silence. That silence would allow the truth to remain hidden far longer than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe. Johnice Jones was living in Harlem in 2002. She was a young child in the care of family members, moving through daily life in a densely populated neighborhood where routines often blur into one another. At some point during that year, she stopped being seen. The sources do not record a specific date, and there is no single moment when concern turned into action. That absence of a clear point in time would later complicate everything. What stands out immediately is what did not happen. No missing person report was filed. There was no formal notification to police that a child could not be located. Without that step, nothing entered the system. There was no file opened, no alert issued, and no early effort to establish where she was last known to be. As far as authorities were concerned, there was nothing to investigate. Within the family, explanations were given. Relatives were told where the child had gone and why she was no longer around. Those explanations were accepted. They sounded ordinary enough to avoid suspicion, and for years they were not challenged. This allowed the situation to remain contained, sealed off from schools, social services, and law enforcement. Because no report existed, there were no early interviews. No one documented the last time she was seen outside the household. No physical spaces were examined. No timeline was preserved while memories were still fresh. The disappearance did not trigger a search because officially it had never been acknowledged. This absence of action was not the result of an ignored warning or a failed response. According to the available record, there was no warning to respond to. The systems designed to protect children rely on visibility. In this case, the disappearance stayed hidden behind familiar explanations and the assumption that someone else knew where the child was. Years later, when investigators would begin asking questions, they would have to work backward through time without the benefit of early records. The delay was not measured in days or months. It stretched across years. By then, opportunities to intervene had long passed. What remains from 2002 is a narrow but critical set of facts. A child lived in Harlem. She disappeared. No report was filed. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was created through inaction, routine, and trust placed in explanations that were never verified. That silence became the foundation on which the rest of the case would unfold. 3 years passed after the child vanished from Harlem. During that time, life continued in a different state, far from where she had last been seen. In 2005, a discovery in Monmouth County, New Jersey, would quietly introduce a new and separate thread, one that no one yet understood was connected to what had been missed earlier. There was no name, no history, and no clear sense of how long the remains had been there. What investigators encountered was not a person, but evidence, incomplete and exposed to time. The skeletal remains of a young child were found in a park area. They were scattered rather than intact, indicating long-term exposure to natural conditions. Weather, animals, and time had altered what was left. The scene did not offer obvious answers. There were no personal items that could immediately point to identity. Clothing that might have helped establish age or origin was not present in a way that could be relied upon. From the outset, investigators were working with limited material. The remains were recovered and transferred for forensic examination. Specialists determined that they belonged to a child, but beyond that, conclusions were restrained. The condition of the bones made it difficult to determine cause of death. There were no clear markers that could confidently establish when the child had died. This uncertainty shaped every step that followed. Without a defined time frame, investigators could not narrow the search to a specific period or event. Standard procedures were followed. The remains were cataloged, preserved, and entered into systems used to track unidentified individuals. Law enforcement agencies rely on these databases to match remains with reported missing persons. In this case, those comparisons produced nothing. No report matched the age range. No missing child file aligned with the available details. The remains existed within the system, but without a counterpart. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed. Without identification, there was no clear jurisdictional origin. The discovery had occurred in New Jersey, but there was no evidence tying the child to any specific community. This left investigators without a starting point. Leads depend on context, and context was missing. Over time, the case became known publicly by a name that reflected its status rather than its substance. The label used by investigators and the media was a placeholder, a way to refer to an unidentified child whose life details were unknown. While the name kept the case visible, it did not move it forward. Visibility alone could not replace information. The limitations of forensic science at the time also played a role. Although DNA analysis existed, it required a comparison. Without a known relative or a matching profile, genetic material could not point to identity. The remains were preserved, but progress depended on future developments that were not yet available. There was no indication during this period that a crime scene had been mishandled or evidence ignored. The challenge was not negligence, but absence. Investigators were confronted with the reality that some cases cannot advance without external data. In this situation, that data had never been created. The discovery in New Jersey stood alone, disconnected from any known disappearance. There was no indication that it belonged to a child missing from New York or from anywhere else. As far as the system was concerned, it was an isolated finding. The connection to a child who had vanished years earlier remained invisible. By the end of 2005, the remains had been documented, examined, and stored within the framework designed for unresolved cases. There were no arrests, no suspects were named. The file did not close, but it did not move forward either. What existed was a record of recovery and uncertainty, waiting for information that did not yet exist. At this point in time, the remains represented a question without context. They were evidence without identity, and identity was the key required to unlock everything that would come later. After the remains were recovered and examined, time began to stretch in a different way. The child found in New Jersey had no identity, no history, and no connection to any reported disappearance. Within official systems, the case existed as a file defined by what was missing rather than what was known. Without a name, progress depended on information that had not yet surfaced. Investigators relied on national databases designed to match unidentified remains with missing persons reports. These systems function only when both sides of the equation exist. In this instance, the remains were logged, but there was nothing to match them against. No child of similar age had been reported missing in a way that aligned with the limited details available. Each comparison ended the same way, without confirmation. The absence of a missing person report from New York played a central role. Without that entry, there was no geographic thread leading back to a specific community. The discovery location alone could not establish origin. Children can move across state lines for countless reasons. and without context, investigators had no basis to narrow possibilities. As years passed, the remains remained preserved. Advances in forensic practice were gradual, and while DNA technology was improving, it still required a point of reference. Genetic material without comparison data could confirm biological facts, but it could not restore identity. The remains waited within evidence storage, neither forgotten nor active. During this period, the case carried a public label used by investigators and the media. The name reflected uncertainty rather than conclusion. It served as a reminder that a child had been found without answers, but it did not create new leads. Public awareness did not translate into identification. There is no indication in the record that law enforcement abandoned responsibility. Instead, the case illustrates the limits of investigation when key information never enters the system. Authorities can examine evidence, preserve material, and review procedures, but they cannot generate missing reports retroactively. The gap between disappearance and discovery widened with time. Memories that might have existed in 2002 faded. Potential witnesses moved, routines changed, and any opportunity for early intervention disappeared. This erosion was not the result of delay after discovery, but of silence before it. Across these years, the remains represented a problem without an entry point. Investigators could not determine where the child had lived, who had cared for her, or when she had last been seen outside a private setting. Without those anchors, even basic questions lacked answers. The case highlights a quiet vulnerability within child protection and missing persons systems. When a disappearance is concealed within familiar explanations, it may never trigger oversight. Schools, neighbors, and agencies depend on signals that something is wrong. In this situation, those signals never reached the surface. As forensic science continued to evolve, the possibility of progress remained distant but real. Preservation mattered. Each year that passed kept open the chance that future methods might succeed where earlier ones could not. That possibility was the only movement in an otherwise static file. By the early years of the next decade, the remains were still unidentified. No suspects had emerged. No arrests had been made. The case existed as an unresolved evidence tied to no known life. It was a record of procedural effort constrained by missing information. What defined this period was not action but waiting. Waiting for technology to advance. Waiting for a report that might never come. Waiting for a connection that had not yet been made. The child remained without a name, and without that name, the path forward remained closed. By 2012, the case that had sat unchanged for years reached a quiet turning point. The remains preserved in New Jersey were still unidentified, but the tools available to examine them had improved. Advances in forensic science had expanded what could be done with material once considered too limited to yield answers. What had been stored as evidence without context was now revisited with renewed purpose. Forensic specialists were able to extract genetic material from the remains. This step did not immediately solve the problem, but it changed the nature of the work. DNA could now be compared beyond the narrow boundaries that had constrained earlier efforts. Instead of relying solely on traditional missing persons files, investigators could look for biological connections that had not previously been accessible. The process required careful verification. Genetic material must be reliable, and comparisons must meet strict standards before conclusions can be drawn. The analysis did not rely on assumptions or probability alone. It required confirmation that a biological relationship existed between the remains and a known individual. This level of certainty was essential before investigators could move forward. Through familial comparison, a match was eventually identified. The remains belonged to John Neese Jones, a child who had lived in Harlem and disappeared a decade earlier. This identification did not arrive with dramatic announcement. It emerged from methodical testing and confirmation. Once verified, it redefined the entire case. With a name restored, the remains were no longer an isolated finding. They became connected to a specific life, a known location, and a defined period. The identification linked New Jersey to New York, and a discovery made years earlier to a disappearance that had gone unreported. What had once existed as two separate realities now converged. This moment marked a shift from uncertainty to accountability. Identification did not answer every question, but it provided direction. Investigators now had a place to start rather than an endless field of possibilities. The focus moved from who the child was to how she had lived and what had happened to her. Jurisdictional coordination followed. Authorities in New Jersey and New York began working together, aligning records and timelines. The identification allowed investigators to examine family structures, living arrangements, and patterns that could not be explored before. It also clarified why earlier comparisons had failed. Without a missing person report, there had been nothing for the remains to match against. The sources do not detail the technical steps of the laboratory work, but they establish its outcome clearly. The identification was accepted by investigators and prosecutors as reliable. It met legal standards and formed the foundation for subsequent actions. From that point forward, the case was no longer defined by anonymity. The impact of identification extended beyond the investigative process. It reframed years of silence. The explanations that had once gone unquestioned were now examined against a confirmed outcome. Statements made within the family could be evaluated in light of what was now known. Time did not erase responsibility, but it did complicate how evidence could be gathered. Investigators faced the challenge of working backward. Events from 2002 had to be reconstructed without the benefit of early documentation. Physical evidence options were limited. The passage of time affected memory and availability of witnesses. Identification opened the door, but it did not simplify what lay beyond it. Still, the significance of the moment cannot be overstated. Identification is the point at which unresolved remains become a human case. It transforms evidence into narrative, not through speculation, but through connection. The child was no longer referred to by a placeholder name. She had an identity, a history, and a place in the record. This development also highlighted the importance of preservation. Because the remains had been properly stored and documented, they were available for re-examination when technology advanced. Without that care, identification might never have been possible. The case illustrates how patience and procedure can matter, even when progress appears stalled. By the end of 2012, the file that had once held an unanswered question now held a confirmed name. The work ahead would be complex and constrained, but it would be grounded in fact rather than uncertainty. Identification did not resolve the case, but it made resolution possible. The years without a name had ended. In their place stood a defined starting point. From that moment forward, the investigation could move with purpose, guided by evidence rather than absence.
Once the child was identified, the focus shifted from uncertainty to reconstruction. Investigators now had a name, a family, and a place where questions could be directed. The task was no longer to determine who the remains belonged to, but to understand how a disappearance had occurred without entering any official record. That shift brought clarity, but it also exposed how much time had altered what could be learned. Attention returned to Harlem and to the household where Joan Niece Jones had lived in 2002. Investigators began reviewing what could be confirmed about her daily life during that period. Without early reports, there were no preserved timelines to rely on. Everything had to be rebuilt using fragments, later statements, and verifiable circumstances that could still be examined. family members became central to this process. According to court records, explanations had been given over the years about the child's absence. These explanations were now assessed against the confirmed identification. What had once been accepted as routine was examined for consistency and accuracy. Investigators compared statements made at different times, noting where details shifted or failed to align. The passage of time shaped every step. Memories from a decade earlier were incomplete. Some individuals were no longer available to speak. Others struggled to recall exact sequences. This required investigators to approach the reconstruction carefully, distinguishing between what could be proven and what could only be suspected. The case demanded restraint because assumptions could not substitute for evidence. Physical evidence from 2002 was largely unavailable. No contemporaneous searches had occurred, no household items had been collected, no locations had been secured. As a result, the investigation relied heavily on testimonial evidence and circumstantial facts that could be corroborated. This placed clear limits on what charges could eventually be pursued. Investigators also examined why the disappearance had not been reported. The absence of school records triggering concern and the lack of documented intervention by child welfare agencies raised questions about how easily a child could be removed from public view when explanations remained internal. This was not treated as a failure of a single institution, but as a convergence of gaps that allowed the situation to remain hidden. Coordination between New Jersey and New York authorities became essential. The discovery location and the place where the child had lived were in different states. Investigators aligned timelines, shared records, and ensured that evidence collected in one jurisdiction could be used appropriately in another. This coordination was procedural rather than dramatic, but it was necessary to move forward. The legal framework shaped investigative decisions. Prosecutors evaluated what could be established beyond reasonable doubt. The age of the case limited options. Some potential charges were no longer viable. Others required specific proof that could not be reconstructed. This evaluation did not reflect uncertainty about responsibility, but recognition of legal thresholds that must be met. Throughout this period, investigators remained focused on documented facts. The identification provided certainty about who the child was, but it did not automatically explain how she died or when. The remains did not offer definitive answers about cause of death. That absence meant the investigation could not rely on forensic conclusions alone. Instead, the case centered on actions taken after the child's death. According to later findings, efforts had been made to conceal what had occurred. These actions, rather than the precise cause of death, formed the basis of legal responsibility. Investigators examined how the body had been handled and how the truth had been withheld. The reconstruction phase required patience. Each verified detail added structure, but also revealed how much had been lost to time. The case moved forward not through sudden discovery, but through careful assembly of what could still be established. Investigators resisted filling gaps with inference, knowing that any unsupported claim would weaken the outcome. By the end of this period, the shape of the case had become clearer. The disappearance was no longer an unexplained absence. It was understood as the result of actions taken within a family setting, followed by years of concealment. The investigation had moved as far as the evidence allowed. What remained was the question of accountability within the limits of law. That question would soon shift from investigative review to formal legal action, guided by what could be proven rather than what might be assumed.
By the time the investigation reached 2013, the uncertainty that had defined the case for years had narrowed into a set of established facts. The identity of the child was confirmed. The place where she had lived was known. The long period of silence that followed her disappearance had been traced back to specific actions and decisions. What remained was the question of legal responsibility and whether the available evidence could support criminal charges. Prosecutors reviewed the findings with caution. The age of the case imposed clear limits. Physical evidence connected directly to the moment of death was not available. The remains, while crucial for identification, did not provide definitive conclusions about cause or timing. This meant that any charges would need to reflect what could be proven, not what might be suspected. The focus shifted toward actions taken after the child's death. Court records later established that efforts had been made to dispose of the body and conceal the truth. These actions formed a factual foundation that prosecutors could rely on. The law allows for accountability even when the precise circumstances of death cannot be fully reconstructed, provided there is evidence of wrongdoing that can be established beyond reasonable doubt. Investigators and prosecutors examined statements given by family members over time. Inconsistencies and false explanations became central. These were not treated as minor discrepancies, but as part of a sustained pattern that had prevented discovery for years. The concealment itself became a critical element of the case. Legal analysis shaped every decision. Prosecutors assessed statutes that applied to child endangerment, hindering apprehension, and conspiracy related to the disposal of a body. They also considered limitations imposed by time and evidence. Some charges that might be expected in a more recent case were not pursued, not because responsibility was unclear, but because the legal standard could not be met with the material available. In early 2013, formal charges were filed against 3 family members. The arrests marked the first public acknowledgement of what had happened to the child. For years, the disappearance and the unidentified remains had existed separately in the public record. The charges connected them, bringing the case into open view. The arrests did not rely on new forensic discoveries. They were based on the cumulative weight of identification, reconstructed timelines, and documented actions taken to conceal the child's death. Prosecutors emphasized that the case was built carefully with attention to what could be supported in court. The charges reflected restraint rather than hesitation. Each count corresponded to conduct that could be demonstrated through evidence and testimony. This approach reduced the risk of overreach and increased the likelihood of accountability. In complex cases involving long delays, this balance is essential. The community response was marked by shock. The realization that a child had disappeared years earlier without notice raised difficult questions. However, the legal process moved forward without commentary or speculation. The focus remained on procedure and proof. After the arrests, the defendants were processed through the court system. Bail considerations, custody decisions, and preliminary hearings formed the established protocols. These steps were not publicized in detail within the sources, but they formed part of the transition from investigation to prosecution. The case now operated within a judicial framework. Investigators shifted from evidence gathering to supporting prosecutorial preparation. The emphasis moved toward documentation, legal filings, and preparation for grand jury review. The goal was no longer discovery, but presentation. Throughout this period, the limits imposed by time remained evident. Prosecutors acknowledged that the case could not answer every question. The absence of early reports and physical evidence constrained what could be alleged. This reality shaped expectations and strategy. What mattered most was that the actions taken after the child's death were no longer hidden. The legal system does not require certainty about every detail to establish responsibility. It requires proof of specific conduct that violates the law. In this case, that proof centered on concealment and endangerment. The arrests represented a shift from silence to accountability. They did not close the case, but they changed its direction. What had once been an unresolved absence was now a matter for the courts. The focus would soon turn to how the evidence would be evaluated and whether the charges would hold. As the case moved forward, the question was no longer whether the child had been forgotten. It was whether the legal process could address what had happened within the boundaries set by fact and law. With arrests made, the case moved deeper into the legal process. The focus turned to whether the evidence assembled over years of silence and delay could withstand formal judicial scrutiny. This stage required careful evaluation, not only of what investigators believed had happened, but of what could be demonstrated under oath and within established legal standards. Grand jury proceedings became central. These hearings are designed to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to move forward toward trial. They are not public forums, and their purpose is limited. Prosecutors present evidence, witnesses testify, and jurors decide whether charges are supported. In this case, the grand jury reviewed a record shaped by absence, reconstruction, and restraint. The evidence presented did not rely on a single decisive finding. Instead, it consisted of multiple elements that, when viewed together, formed a coherent picture. Identification of the child provided the foundation. Without it, no legal action would have been possible. Once identity was confirmed, investigators could place the child within a family structure and examine events that followed her disappearance. Testimonial evidence played a significant role. Statements made by family members over time were compared for consistency. Prosecutors focused on explanations given about the child's whereabouts and how those explanations changed. These discrepancies were not treated as isolated errors. They were presented as part of a broader pattern that delayed discovery and prevented intervention. The Justia appellate record later summarized how this testimony was evaluated. Witness accounts were assessed alongside circumstantial facts, such as the absence of reporting and the eventual recovery of remains in another state. The prosecution did not claim to resolve every unanswered question. Instead, it emphasized actions that could be shown to have occurred, particularly those involving concealment. Physical evidence, while limited, was not absent. The remains themselves established that the child had died and that her body had been disposed of in a manner intended to prevent discovery. Although the condition of the remains did not allow for a definitive cause of death, their location and handling were relevant. The act of disposal became a key point of legal consideration. Prosecutors framed the case around responsibility rather than speculation. They avoided claims that could not be substantiated. This approach reflected an understanding of the risks involved in presenting an older case. Overstating conclusions could undermine credibility. Precision mattered more than breadth. The grand jury process also required careful explanation of context. Jurors needed to understand why no missing-person report existed and how that absence affected the timeline. Prosecutors explained that the lack of early documentation was itself part of the factual record. It did not mitigate responsibility, but it shaped how evidence had to be interpreted. Jurisdictional elements were addressed as well. The child had lived in New York, but the remains were found in New Jersey. Prosecutors clarified how authority was established and why charges were brought where they were. This coordination ensured that legal proceedings rested on solid procedural ground. Throughout this stage, the tone of the case remained measured. There were no dramatic claims or emotional appeals. The presentation focused on facts that could be verified and actions that could be demonstrated. This restraint was deliberate. The goal was not to secure the harshest possible outcome, but to achieve a lawful one. The indictments that followed reflected this careful approach. Each charge corresponded to conduct supported by evidence reviewed by the grand jury. The decisions signaled that the case would move forward, but within clearly defined boundaries. This clarity reduced uncertainty for all parties involved. As the case advanced beyond indictment, the nature of the process changed. The emphasis shifted from whether charges were justified to how the case would be resolved. The groundwork laid during evidence evaluation would shape everything that followed. What defined this stage was discipline. Years of uncertainty had given way to structured legal review. The system now demanded precision, and every claim had to withstand scrutiny. The case moved forward not on emotion, but on the careful alignment of fact, law, and responsibility. As the case moved forward, the path it would take became clearer. The charges were defined, the evidence had been reviewed, and the limits of what could be proven were well understood. In late 2013, the process shifted again, this time away from the uncertainty of a possible trial and toward resolution within the courtroom. The defendants chose to enter guilty pleas. This decision altered the direction of the proceedings. A trial would have required the court to examine evidence shaped by long delays, missing early records, and memories altered by time. By pleading guilty, responsibility for specific actions was formally acknowledged without requiring jurors to weigh every unresolved question. The pleas focused on conduct that prosecutors could establish with confidence. They did not attempt to resolve every detail surrounding the child's death. Instead, they addressed actions taken afterward, particularly those involving concealment and the disposal of the body. This approach reflected the legal reality of the case. Accountability was anchored to provable acts rather than speculation. Guilty pleas serve a practical function within the justice system. They reduce the burden of extended proceedings and provide certainty of outcome. In this case, they also acknowledged that the truth had been hidden for years. The pleas placed that acknowledgement on the record, replacing silence with formal admission. The sources do not describe dramatic courtroom moments or emotional statements. The process unfolded through legal filings and scheduled hearings. The tone remained procedural. What mattered was not performance, but accuracy. Each plea was entered under oath and accepted by the court after review. By avoiding a trial, the case moved more quickly toward sentencing. This efficiency did not diminish the seriousness of the matter. Instead, it reflected an understanding that the core facts were no longer in dispute. The identity of the child was known. The handling of her remains had been established. The concealment that delayed discovery had been acknowledged. The pleas also shaped the scope of public understanding. Rather than a prolonged examination of incomplete evidence, the case was resolved within defined legal boundaries. This limited speculation and prevented unsupported narratives from taking hold. From a procedural standpoint, the guilty pleas marked a transition from contested process to judicial determination of consequences. The court's role shifted from evaluating evidence to deciding appropriate sentences within statutory limits. The groundwork laid during earlier stages now guided that outcome. The decision to plead guilty did not answer every question left by the years of silence. It did not reconstruct the events of 2002 in detail. It did not fill every gap created by the absence of early reporting. What it did accomplish was formal accountability for actions that could be proven. This stage of the case carried a quieter tone. The intensity of investigation and indictment gave way to resolution through established legal mechanisms. The focus narrowed, concentrating on responsibility and consequence rather than discovery. By the end of this period, the uncertainty that had once surrounded the case was largely resolved. The court had accepted the pleas, and the matter moved toward sentencing. The years of waiting had given way to a defined outcome, shaped not by emotion, but by the careful application of law to fact. In 2014, the case reached the point where consequences were formally determined. With guilty pleas entered, the court's responsibility shifted to sentencing. This stage required careful balance. Judges were tasked with weighing established facts, the limits of the law, and the seriousness of conduct that had unfolded over many years. Sentencing hearings focused on the actions acknowledged through the pleas. The court considered how the child's death had been concealed, and how that concealment had delayed discovery for more than a decade. While the precise circumstances of the death itself could not be fully reconstructed, the court did not treat that absence as mitigating. Responsibility was measured by what had been done afterward and by the impact of those actions. Prison terms were imposed in accordance with plea agreements and statutory guidelines. The sentences reflected the gravity of endangering a child and conspiring to dispose of her body. Judges emphasized that the length of time the truth had been hidden was a significant factor. The prolonged concealment had prevented accountability and denied the child recognition and protection for years. The court also acknowledged the constraints that shaped the case. The age of the evidence limited the range of charges available. This was not presented as a failure of prosecution, but as a consequence of delayed reporting and lost opportunity. The legal system can only respond within the boundaries of what is provable, and those boundaries had been set long before the case reached court. Sentencing marked the first moment when the outcome became fixed. Until then, the case had been defined by possibility and uncertainty. With sentences imposed, that uncertainty narrowed. The decisions placed responsibility on the record and established a clear legal conclusion. Public reaction at this stage was measured. The sources do not describe demonstrations or heightened emotion in the courtroom. Instead, the focus remained on the legal resolution. The case had already unfolded quietly, and its conclusion followed the same pattern. From a procedural standpoint, sentencing closed the primary phase of the case. The investigation had ended, prosecution had concluded. What remained was the enforcement of the court's orders. The system had reached its formal response. Judges also addressed the broader context without speculation. They noted that the absence of early intervention allowed the situation to remain hidden. This observation was not framed as commentary, but as recognition of how the case had developed. The court did not assign blame beyond the defendants, but it did acknowledge the consequences of silence. The sentences imposed were consistent with the charges that had been sustained. There was no indication of extraordinary deviation from guidelines. The outcome reflected restraint and adherence to law rather than symbolic punishment. With sentencing complete, the case entered a new phase defined by finality. The child's identity had been restored, responsibility had been established. While not every question had been answered, the legal record now contained a clear account of wrongdoing and consequence. The conclusion of sentencing did not bring closure in an emotional sense. The court's role is not to provide that. Its function is to apply law to fact and to impose penalties where warranted. In this case, that function was carried out within the limits imposed by time and evidence. By the end of 2014, the long path from disappearance to accountability had reached a formal endpoint. What had begun as an unreported absence was now a documented criminal case with defined outcomes. The record stood complete, grounded in fact, and resolved through the legal process. After sentencing, the case entered a quieter stage, one shaped by legal review rather than public attention. This period focused on whether the proceedings that led to conviction and punishment had followed proper legal standards. The process did not revisit the facts of the case in a narrative sense. Instead, it examined how those facts had been handled within the justice system. One defendant pursued an appeal, challenging aspects of the conviction and sentencing. Appeals are not retrials. They do not reassess guilt or innocence. Their purpose is to determine whether legal errors occurred that could have affected the outcome. In this case, the review centered on procedure, not on disputing what had been acknowledged through guilty pleas. The appellate court examined the record created during earlier proceedings. This included filings, testimony summaries, and the legal reasoning applied at sentencing. The focus remained narrow. The court evaluated whether the trial court had acted within its authority and whether the defendant's rights had been protected. The Athol Justia appellate decision later outlined this review. It addressed claims raised by the defense and assessed them against established legal standards. The court found no reversible error. The procedures followed during prosecution and sentencing were upheld as lawful and appropriate. This outcome confirmed the stability of the case's resolution. The appellate process did not introduce new evidence or reinterpret existing facts. It served as a safeguard, ensuring that the legal system had operated correctly. When the appeal was denied, the convictions and sentences remained in place. Judicial review underscored the structured nature of the case. From identification to sentencing, each step had been shaped by constraint and verification. The appellate court's role was not to provide commentary, but to affirm that those steps met required standards. The appeal also highlighted the importance of restraint exercised earlier in the case. Prosecutors had limited charges to conduct that could be proven. Judges had imposed sentences within guidelines. These decisions reduced vulnerability to challenge. The appellate outcome reflected that careful approach. For the public, this stage passed with little attention. Appeals rarely generate the visibility of arrests or sentencing, yet they serve a critical function. They test the integrity of the process and confirm whether justice has been applied correctly. With the appeal resolved, the legal path narrowed further. Options for challenge diminished. The case moved closer to finality, defined by settled convictions and enforced sentences. This stage did not alter the factual record, it reinforced it. The findings of the lower court stood, supported by review at a higher level. The legal system had completed its examination. By the end of this period, the case had moved beyond dispute. What remained was the record itself, preserved through judicial scrutiny and upheld through appeal. The process had been long, but it had followed a consistent course, grounded in law rather than emotion. The appellate review marked the final check within the courtroom. Beyond this point, the case existed not as an active proceeding, but as a concluded matter, documented and affirmed through every available level of review. With the legal process largely complete, attention shifted to what the case revealed beyond the courtroom. The outcome did not produce new facts, but it clarified how a child could disappear in a major city and remain unnoticed for years. The impact was felt not through public spectacle, but through quiet recognition of how ordinary systems had failed to engage. The disappearance did not trigger alarms because it never entered official channels. Schools, social services, and law enforcement depend on reports and visible signs of concern. In this situation, explanations given within a family setting were accepted and not questioned. That acceptance allowed the absence to blend into routine life. The case demonstrated how easily silence can be mistaken for normalcy. Communities often assume that serious harm will announce itself through obvious warning signs. This case showed that harm can remain concealed when it occurs behind familiar walls. Neighbors may not notice. Institutions may not receive information. Without a report, there is nothing to act upon. The systems designed to protect children require participation to function. The length of time between disappearance and identification exposed a vulnerability in how missing children are tracked. Databases rely on entries. For years, the remains in New Jersey and the absence in New York existed separately. Each was recorded in isolation. Only advances in forensic science allowed those records to intersect. Until then, the gap remained unbridged. The case also highlighted the limits of forensic progress when foundational information is missing. Preservation of evidence mattered, but it could not compensate for the absence of early documentation. Identification restored a name, but it could not recover lost time or reconstruct events that were never recorded. From a procedural perspective, the case underscored the importance of reporting mechanisms. Early reports create timelines. Timelines enable investigation. Investigation allows intervention. When the first step does not occur, each subsequent step becomes more difficult. The system is sequential, and interruption at the start has lasting effects. The response after identification demonstrated the value of coordination. Once the connection between states was established, agencies worked within defined roles. That cooperation was effective, but it came late. The case showed that jurisdictional boundaries are manageable when information exists, but they become obstacles when it does not. Public awareness following the arrests reflected a broader discomfort. The realization that a child could vanish without notice challenged assumptions about safety and oversight. The reaction was not driven by sensational detail, but by recognition of how ordinary explanations can delay accountability. The legal outcome also offered a lesson in restraint. Prosecutors pursued charges that could be proven, not those that might satisfy expectation. This approach resulted in convictions that withstood appeal. It demonstrated that measured decisions strengthen outcomes, even when they leave some questions unanswered. The case did not produce sweeping policy change within the sources provided, but it added to a record of examples illustrating systemic gaps. It showed how child welfare depends on vigilance at multiple levels: family, community, and institution. Failure at one level can conceal harm from all others. What remains is a documented account of how absence, when unchallenged, can persist. The case stands as a reminder that systems respond to signals. When signals are withheld or ignored, protection cannot occur. The responsibility to notice and report is distributed, not centralized. The impact of the case lies in its clarity. It does not rely on dramatic turns or hidden conspiracies. It shows how delay, silence, and routine explanations can shape outcomes as powerfully as action. The lessons are procedural rather than emotional. In the end, the case added a name to a set of remains and accountability to a long period of concealment. It also added to the understanding of how easily a child can disappear when systems never receive a reason to act. The case now exists as a complete legal record, defined not by speculation or unresolved mystery, but by documented fact. What began as an absence without acknowledgement moved through years of uncertainty and ended with responsibility established through lawful process. The conclusion did not arrive quickly, and it did not resolve every unanswered detail, but it placed accountability where the evidence allowed. The record confirms a sequence shaped by silence. A child disappeared without a report. Years later, remains were found without identity. Only through preservation and scientific progress did those separate events connect. That connection made legal action possible, even after time had erased many opportunities for early intervention. The outcome reflects the limits and strengths of the justice system. The system could not recreate what was lost in 2002. It could not restore early oversight or recover unrecorded moments. What it could do was examine actions that were provable and apply the law accordingly. That is what occurred. The convictions and sentences did not depend on emotional framing or assumption. They rested on identification, verified conduct, and acknowledgement through guilty pleas. The appellate review confirmed that the process followed required standards. Each step reinforced the stability of the outcome. The case also stands as an example of how accountability can still emerge after long delay. Time narrowed the range of charges, but it did not erase responsibility. The law addressed what could be shown, not what could be imagined. That distinction protected the integrity of the result. There is no sense of resolution that suggests closure in a personal or emotional way. Courts do not provide that. They provide record, consequence, and finality within defined limits. In this case, finality came through documentation rather than revelation. What remains is a clear sequence: a disappearance without reporting, a discovery without identity, years without connection, scientific advancement, legal reconstruction, charges, pleas, sentencing, review. Each step followed from the last, guided by evidence rather than narrative. The case reinforces a broader understanding of accountability. It shows that responsibility does not always appear immediately. Sometimes it emerges slowly, constrained by what survives time. When it does, it relies on patience, verification, and restraint. The record also underscores the importance of early action. While later accountability was achieved, the absence of early reporting shaped every outcome that followed. This reality is not framed as a judgment, but as a fact established through the sequence of events. In the end, the case is neither unresolved nor overstated. It is complete within its boundaries. The identity of the child is known. The actions taken after her death are documented. Legal responsibility has been assigned. Appeals have been reviewed. The matter has concluded within the justice system. What remains is the record itself, preserved for public understanding and institutional memory. It stands as an example of how investigative persistence, scientific development, and legal discipline can converge, even after years of silence. The final measure of the case is not how it feels, but what it establishes. It establishes accountability grounded in fact. It establishes limits imposed by time. It establishes that even when a disappearance goes unnoticed, it does not remain beyond reach forever.